Hi, this is Rachel Cline again, responding to questions from Nancy White's students at SUNY Adirondack. I think I've got the table to rock a little less than last time, but we may have some noises. So I don't know if you've all read each other's questions, and some of them overlap a little bit, but I'm just going to read each one and then respond. I have some notes, but I just kind of respond extemporaneously. Ha ha. Okay, so the first question I have here is, I always like to ask about process because I'm a writing dork and find it interesting. And I'm wondering if that's from Nancy. So my process, which I discovered maybe in my 30s, works best if I wake up and get myself to sit down and start working before I have coffee, but really before anything else. Definitely before looking at what the day holds or getting dressed. As soon as I start letting myself think about myself in terms of other people's expectations, the whole thing is out the window. And I've always had another job, with a very momentary exceptions. And so often what I've wound up being able to do is, after being at a place for like a year, I've been able to persuade my boss that if I work from home on Fridays, I can do the same amount of work as I do in 4 days and just not schedule any meetings. And then from the writing side of the street, I would have 3 solid mornings of writing, and that would be enough to sort of have enough momentum to show up again a week later. That's what works for me. Who knows what works for anybody else? Second question. What are some of your favorite authors, books to read that have inspired you? So if you actually read the whole book, I think the books that inspired me are on the bookshelf in Nora's grandfather's apartment. So I'll just skip ahead to when I was your age, and I started discovering contemporary writers who inspired me. And I think the real eye-openers for me at that point were Grace Paley. It was such a revelation to me that someone could write in that voice, in just what sounded like a voice that I knew from around the neighborhood. Also, Lorrie Moore, who has the kind of fun, she just has so much fun with words. And I thought that was inspiring to see somebody whose work was taken seriously, but also who was just like obviously having a gas while she was doing it. Also a writer named Laurie Colwin, who died young and unfortunately also stopped writing fiction. She just started writing cookbooks at a certain point because I guess the life of a fiction writer was so hard. But she wrote these very sort of charming, they felt very real stories set in New York, but they had a kind of lightness and possibility to them that I adored. 2 novels that I go back to again and again and reread, and I don't know that these are anybody else's 2 novels, are The Good Soldier by Madox, which it's just like a puzzle piece of a thing. It also, the opening line, "This is the saddest story I have ever heard," knocked me into the next week the first time I read it. And The Go-Between by J.P. Hartley, which is sort of a big clumpy novel about a little boy at an English country house watching the adults have an affair. And why is it a favorite? It's the way he renders a child's viewpoint and an adult world in the same book. It's just wonderful. And then finally, as I try to figure out my own life, I've discovered the journals of the poet May Sarton, who she's got the first one that I read, which I also came across in my 30s, is called Journal of a Solitude, and she's writing it after the breakup of a big relationship, and she's just miserable and kind of learning to live again by herself in a house in Maine. Anyway, as I've gotten older, I've found that there are many more volumes of May Sarton's journals, and they all teach you how to live by yourself in a house in Maine. Third question, about giving voice to Bob Rasmussen, and I'd like to know how, if at all, finding my way, into his character was different from the other characters, given the nature of his transgressions. So this is an interesting sort of generation gap question. One of my motives in writing the book was to help people see how not shocked we all were by his transgressions at the time. And nor, this comes up in a later question, but, we didn't see his wife as a enabler. We didn't have that word. That wasn't a word. We saw them as sort of fascinating hippies. And really, for most of my life, I didn't look at him that way. But part of why I wanted to write the book was to show people, younger people who can't comprehend this, what that felt like. So, but the fact that maybe you guys just can't comprehend it is perhaps a good thing. And I also, there's a little piece on YouTube of me talking to a friend of mine, Lisa Miller, about Rasmussen's voice and why I was able to write it so well, which basically just has to do with the fact that in real life, my teacher, like Rasmussen, wrote in our journals, like made little comments in the journals that we kept for him. Sorry, I'm having a little functional problem. And I internalized it. I mean, the first time I sat down to write in his voice, it just blew. I had it in my head. I knew that guy inside and out. So it wasn't difficult. Sorry. Was there a certain moment in your life that made you think, I definitely need to write this experience down and make it into a book? And the answer to that is no. I've had that experience sometimes with movie ideas, which I think need to be more of a thing that you can boil down to a sentence. I just kept coming back to it, I mean, I wrote a story about it in high school. I wrote another version of that, or I never finished that, and I just kept reworking it in my 20s. Sometime after that, I first wrote a version of The Dark Room, the piece I asked you guys to read. And it never felt like I had gotten to the bottom of it. So it really wasn't that I thought it was such a great idea. It was just that I knew I'd written 2 other books, and this just kept coming back. So I went for it. And it took 10 years, which I can't recommend to anyone. Number 4. As someone who aspires to be a fiction writer, I'd like to ask what the hardest part of turning your real-life experience into fiction what was the hardest part of turning your real-life experience into fiction, as well as extending it? So I think there are 2 hardest parts. One is taking liberties with other people who, have real-life analogs. Certainly not everything that happens in my book. Well, I made up a life and a backstory for Rasmussen that I couldn't know the truth of. Naomi also, she's completely invented. The real life Rasmussen had a wife, but I don't know anything about her childhood or anything. But mostly Beth, who's based on my best friend from 7th grade, but who I had not seen again and knew nothing about what became of her at all. So, everything that I attribute to that character is made up, and some of it's not so great, right? So I that was painful, and I felt uncertain about a lot of it. Seeing myself as a character, also very difficult. Nora is me, but she's not. And I did a lot of work. I think I go back to this later. But, things I did to make sure that I was obsessed with people, with Nora not being a victim, So I made her rich, so that nobody could feel sorry for her because she has all the resources she needs. I made her sort of checked out. She lets her cat roam out in the street in New York City, which is insane if you care about your cat, and she does. And something I would never do in a million years. And I made her an only child of this, pretty intense mother. I too had a pretty intense mother. But I have some thoughts about only children, and because my mother was one, and I wanted her to have that sort of lack. To put it another way, as a child with a sibling, I, from a very early age, understood that there were other people in the world who had needs, and who were, who I would have to get along with. And my mother, an only child, has a sort of obliviousness to that that was always astounding to me. So I gave Nora that a little bit so that she would not be as self-aware as I am. Because to make her different from me. So that's still more about what was the hardest thing, I think. Right? Yes, and then the other hardest thing is, of course, throwing stuff away. But I threw so much stuff away on this book. I think I've thrown away I had at least 5 drafts that were distinctly different. Not like I changed the name of a character, but whole different idea. So, I've thrown away hundreds and hundreds and possibly thousands of pages. So I got really good at it. And, that's good for a writer. 6. If you could go back and change one thing about how you wrote The Question Authority, would you? If so, what would it be? So I was a little confused about whether this was, would I change anything about how I presented the story in the book, or would I change anything about how I went about the writing process? I sometimes have second thoughts about the sections of Beth and Nora when they were young, because when I read them, they sound so young, and it's a little bit unusual for an adult novel, I think. But I really wanted people to understand that 14 on the outside is really different from 14 on the inside. And I believe that those conversations are true to how we were at that age. So I'm committed to having them there. I just sometimes feel a little funny when I come across them. From the other side of that question, if I could have done it differently, I wouldn't have taken 10 years, but oh well. So this is very closely related. Did you ever consider publishing this as a young adult novel, not from the point of view of a middle-aged woman dealing with the past, but from the 8th grader's point of view instead? Now that books like Speak have been published and accepted, would this be a good topic for young readers too? So I have no idea what's a good topic for young readers. I don't have any children, and I feel like people want to protect young kids from a full understanding of this whole subject, maybe. But I don't actually. Here's an interesting thing to say. I don't actually wish that none of this ever happened to me. I don't. my whole life is my whole life, and I wouldn't change any of it. So, maybe it is okay for young readers. The story I was telling was the story that I understood, which was about what happens to, how this whole experience changes your life over time, and the impact that it still has on middle-aged people. And I couldn't have understood, when I was young, my understanding of Rasmussen was not nuanced at all. Like, it never occurred to me that he had parents, or that, he might have been in love once with a girl his own age when it was appropriate, and gotten stuck there when that was taken away from him. I realize that's not really in the novel, but it's an idea that I came across in reading about people with this disorder. Okay, Rachel, were there any moments within your work of writing where you had to stop or not include a section because it was maybe a moment you weren't ready to speak about, or a moment in your life where you had to change a lot of the things that actually happened to fit in your work? So this is, again, where the hardest thing was making Nora not me. And was there anything I didn't include because it was sort of too sensitive? No. I mean, that's why, A, that's why you make it fiction. But B, for me, that's why I'm a writer. I mean, so that I can tell the truth, fully tell the truth in some context. Because you can't always tell even the people you love the whole truth. Painful, but true. I left out something about why I killed her mother, Nora's mother. So I wanted her mother to be dead so that Nora has no other obligations in life, so that she's not beholden to anyone, and that she also has no one to argue with in the present of the book. It's all, she's just forced back into herself. And also, quite literally, because when I was writing it, my mother was in her 90s, and sort of midway through that, she developed dementia, and I knew she was going to die. And I wanted to sort of see what it felt like to grieve for her, and write through some of that grief before I actually had to live it in real life. Which is another sort of, benefit of being a writer, is you can try things out without having to hurt any other people. One hopes. All right. 9. The chapter where Nora wishes that Naomi had written the song, that Naomi had had a voice of her own, gave me goosebumps at the end. It feels really huge that Nora could think anything positive for or about Naomi, because after all, Naomi didn't do anything to protect or help those girls, maybe even the opposite. Was it hard to basically have your main character forgive Naomi and not hold her so responsible? What made you include this? 2 things. One is, again, sort of in real life, I've often wondered about the woman who was married to my teacher. Also, many people who read earlier drafts of the book that didn't have Naomi in it so much were always asked questions about her. Why, how did that work? She had her own kids? What? So I put more of her in because of those reader questions, but then I became sort of fascinated by her. And the stuff about, her handwriting haunting Nora, that's me. I mean, I was just very aware that there was this person in the background sort of enabling our work. I said we didn't have that word enabling, but in a different sense, handwriting the actual words that we wrote onto these stencils so they could be reproduced. And what made me include this chapter is actually the story about the folk song. we did not write a folk song in his class, but that I did go to a summer camp where there was this folk song that supposedly was the original composition of one of the counselors, and then a couple years later I was somewhere else and somebody else started singing it, and I was like, oh my God, you know so-and-so? And they were like, no, that's from my camp. It was written by this other guy. So it was like one of these two guys is a liar, which one is it, we'll never know. And one of them was African American. And there was something, and I probably should work more on this, but there was something about that, the assumption that the black guy was, had stolen the material, but also the immediate understanding that, no, that's racist, and then, but what is a folk song anyway? It's something that we all, that gets changed and evolves over its life. Felt to me of a piece with the questions in this book. I mean, obviously it's not a book about race, but I think some of the societal, I think it's about the societal assumptions about what's sex and what's okay to do and say around children. It's that same sort of, it's the stuff we don't talk about and have, very highly coded reactions to. And which have such an enormous impact on how we live, but we never really unpack them. I mean, we're just starting to about race, but I think the sex stuff is way, way behind on that curve. I think there's a lot more to say about that, and I won't try to do it now. So I think this is, no. There's still a few more. I'm sorry this is taking so long. Hi, Rachel and Elby wrote I'm just going to summarize. What other ideas for the novel did you have, if any? So here are a few different ways I tried to write it first. The first draft was on the trip out west, which in reality there was such a trip, and I didn't go at the last minute, and I always felt left out. So I tried to write the trip I didn't go on. The next idea I had was to write Lolita from the girl's point of view, which is a brilliant idea, and somebody should do that. But I couldn't, it was too sort of artificial and intellectually pretentious for me. Version where Nora's character is a teacher in the same school with the perpetrating man. Version, I mentioned this before, where Nora works in the call center. Oh, and the Tisbottle version. I wrote a version where every chapter was a writing exercise from Rasmussen's class, written by a student. And that got me through a whole month at a writing colony. And I'm not sure anything survives, but I think that's why there are poems in the book. That's why the grandfather's poem is there, and that's why Beth's silly poem and the girl's poem about 9/11, the "You Told Me I Was Beautiful" poem. Yeah, but I had a lot of fun. Notify NYC wants to tell me something. What are your favorite things to write about? I have no idea. And anything that surprises me, I am very happy to write about. Do I have any particular work of writing which is, in my opinion, my best work? This one, because it took so darn long, and it's sort of closest to my own life. But I also, last spring I just wrote a fable about a horse made out of wood that isn't sure he's really a horse. And I wrote it all, I woke up one morning with having had a dream about this wooden horse, and just wrote this whole thing down that morning. So I'm proud of that, because I feel like it was kind of magic. Of course, I probably never publish it, but there you go. have I ever had to deal with any censorship? Only that in my mind. So, and then this is this sort of, hi Rachel, I'm very intrigued by the question authority. I hope to pick it up if ever this COVID-19 thing passes. I wish that for all of us. My question for you, in times like these, in the times of this pandemic, how do you keep positive? Is it mostly writing? Are there other ways to enable a therapeutic way of life during a quarantine? I know it's a little of a tough question, but basically summed up, what can we do as a society to keep our mental health positive in times like these, whether it be reading, writing, or anything? And, you know, this question makes me cry. I am so sorry for you young people living through this. And for everyone who's losing people, it's horrible. But I think that yes, what we can do is connect, you know, is keep focusing on things that you care about and building, you know, this teaches you a thing that you need to know for life, which is that you need resources, you know, and not just financial ones, but you need things that you can do in your time with your heart and your head that will sustain you. And, you know, when I taught, I used to always tell my students, you know, you always have to have another project on the burner, you know. It's because the one in the foreground, the one you think is the one, often, you know, goes through fallow periods. So you need to have something else going on. And, you know, and sometimes going on just means like you're asking yourself questions in your journal, or you're corresponding with a friend about it. You know, you're trading texts, you're taking a book out of the library, or doing research on the internet. You know, just stirring the pot. I think I used that metaphor already. Yeah. So, but I think the other thing we're finding out now that is there's just nothing that replaces human contact, and you know, I so appreciate that you've asked me these questions, and I can kind of sorta feel like there's somebody there. I mean, I do feel like you guys are there, and you know, I've been, you know, Zooming and Skyping and all that jazz with my friends and my family, but it's just, there's nothing, it's so lonely, and I'm so sorry. So keep writing. Thank you.